Imagine a world turned upside down. It is the 6th century BC, and the people of Judah, once proud inhabitants of Jerusalem, find themselves torn from their homeland, exiled to the distant and unfamiliar lands of Babylon, the city of their ancestors, the temple that had stood as the center of their faith, and the streets where generations had walked are now memories, fading yet persistent, carried in their hearts across the vast rivers and plains of a foreign world. Among these displaced people is a man named Ezekiel, a young priest of 30, trained in the sacred traditions of his people, now faced with a reality he could never have imagined. Ezekiel is not just any exile. In him resides a spark of destiny, a calling that will alter the course of history not through conquest or war, but through visions, words, and actions that will resonate across generations. As he stands by the waters of the Kibar River, the weight of his people's despair presses upon him. Their spirits are as turbulent as the waters flowing before him. Uncertain, wary, and searching for hope. In this moment of dislocation and sorrow, Ezekiel is about to encounter the extraordinary. One day, as he gazes at the river, reflecting on the life he once knew, the heavens themselves seem to open not in a literal tearing of the sky, but in a way that bends reality and perception. What he witnesses is unlike anything human eyes have seen. Celestial beings, intricate wheels moving in perfect harmony, and above it all, a magnificent throne of sapphire where a radiant figure sits, shining with a brilliance that blends fire and light, glory and majesty. It is a vision so profound that it overwhelms the senses. Yet it is only the beginning of Ezekiel's journey. This vision is not a mere spectacle. It is a divine summons. Ezekiel is called to stand, to listen, and to act. He is appointed as a watchman for the people of Israel, entrusted with a sacred mission. To observe, to warn, and to guide. His task is immense. The people he must speak to are wary, stubborn, and often resistant to guidance. Yet he is strengthened, armed not with weapons, but with courage, vision, and the unwavering presence of the divine. Through this story, we will explore the life and prophecies of Ezekiel, his visions, his symbolic acts, and the lessons he brought to a people in exile. We will witness how one man's faith, resilience, and obedience became a beacon of hope and a source of wisdom for generations to come. If you are intrigued by tales of courage, divine encounter, and timeless lessons from history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss the journey into the extraordinary life of Ezekiel, the prophet who saw the throne of God. Together, let us step back into a world of exile, vision, and divine purpose. By the time Ezekiel reached the age of 30, he had already spent years immersed in the traditions and rituals of his people, studying the sacred texts and preparing himself to serve in the Temple of Jerusalem. Yet the course of his life was about to take an unimaginable turn. Removed from the familiar streets, temples, and hills of his homeland, he now found himself among exiles in Babylon, a land that felt both alien and unwelcoming, where the familiar cadence of worship and the comforting presence of his community were replaced by the distant echoes of a life left behind. It was along the banks of the Kibar River, its waters flowing with a restless energy, reflecting the turbulence in the hearts of those who had been uprooted from their homes, that Ezekiel's world was transformed forever. One day, as he stood silently by the river, gazing at its currents and reflecting on the life he had been forced to leave behind, something extraordinary unfolded before him. It was not a vision that could be measured by the ordinary senses, nor could it be compared to anything he had ever read or been taught. The heavens seemed to open in a manner that transcended physical space, as if the boundaries between the earthly and the divine had dissolved, revealing a reality both astonishing and terrifying in its magnificence. Before his eyes, the very essence of the spiritual world seemed to manifest, He saw living beings whose forms defied simple description, each adorned with multiple faces, their wings and hands moving in synchronized harmony as if attuned to a purpose beyond human comprehension. Beside these beings were wheels within wheels, intricate and luminous, moving in perfect unison with the celestial creatures, responding instantly to their every motion, a display of divine precision that conveyed both intelligence and omnipresence. Above this astonishing spectacle, a firmament of crystal-like brilliance stretched across his vision, and atop it sat a throne of the deepest sapphire, radiating majesty and power. Seated upon this throne was a figure of indescribable glory, emanating light and fire, brilliance and judgment, a presence that seemed to encompass both the awe-inspiring authority of the divine and the gentle promise of care and guidance. The image was so overwhelming that Ezekiel fell face down, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. And yet, within that fear and wonder, there was a profound clarity. He was being called to something greater than himself, summoned to a mission that would shape not only his life, but the spiritual destiny of his people. As he rose to stand, guided by a voice that resonated with both authority and intimacy, Ezekiel realized that this vision was not merely a spectacle to inspire awe, but a calling to action. The divine spoke directly to him, entrusting him with a role that carried immense responsibility and weight, that of a watchman for Israel. He would be charged with observing the spiritual and moral state of his people, interpreting their struggles, warning them of impending dangers, and guiding them toward hope and restoration. Yet this role was not to be an easy one, for the people he would address were weary from exile, their hearts hardened by loss and suffering, their faith tested and fragile. They might resist his words, turn away from his warnings, and doubt the message he carried. But Ezekiel was promised strength beyond his own, a fortitude that would enable him to face stubborn hearts with unwavering resolve. The vision itself contained lessons that would echo throughout his prophetic mission, not merely in its imagery, but in the very way it spoke of harmony, interconnectedness, and divine order, the wheels moving in perfect coordination with the living beings, the crystal firmament reflecting light onto the sapphire throne, and the radiant figure seated above all of creation illustrated a cosmos in which every element had purpose. Every motion reflected intention, and every presence was unified in service to a higher will. Ezekiel understood that his role, though fraught with challenges, was part of this larger divine order, that he was to act as both interpreter and messenger, bridging the world of the exiles with the transcendent reality he had glimpsed, and that through his words and symbolic actions, he could awaken understanding and faith among those who felt abandoned. The imagery he saw would come to define his life's work, not just as a visionary experience, but as a blueprint for communication and teaching. The living beings, the wheels, and the throne were not only manifestations of divine power but symbols, conveying ideas about vigilance, responsibility, unity, and reverence. The brilliance of the figure on the throne reminded Ezekiel that even amid exile, despair, and dislocation, the presence of God was not distant. It was immediate, radiant, and capable of instilling hope. In that moment by the river, Ezekiel's identity transformed. He was no longer simply a priest in training or a member of a displaced community. He had become a conduit for divine wisdom, a vessel chosen to carry visions of both warning and promise to a people who needed them more than ever. From that day forward, Ezekiel's life was inseparable from the extraordinary vision that had opened before him. Every action, every word of prophecy, and every symbolic gesture would carry the weight of the encounter by the Kebar River. It was here that his purpose was revealed, where the extraordinary became the foundation for the ordinary tasks of teaching, guiding, and sustaining hope among exiles. Through vision and obedience, Ezekiel would emerge not merely as a messenger, but as a living testament to the power of faith, the capacity of human resilience, and the enduring presence of the divine, even in the most dislocated and uncertain of circumstances. The moment Ezekiel received his vision by the Kibar River was not only a revelation of the divine majesty, but also the beginning of a profound responsibility that would define the rest of his life. A calling that would intertwine the extraordinary with the deeply human struggles of his people. As the radiant figure on the sapphire throne impressed itself upon his senses, Ezekiel understood that what he saw was not an end in itself, but a summons to serve, to stand as a mediator between the transcendent and the exiled community that surrounded him. A people whose hearts were heavy with loss, and whose spirits were clouded with doubt and fear. In that instant, the weight of divine expectation settled upon him. And with it came the charge that he would bear for the years ahead, to become a watchman, a guardian of moral and spiritual truth, a voice that would pierce the despair and apathy of a nation in exile. To be a watchman was no ordinary task. It demanded more than knowledge, more than ritual observance, more than eloquent speech. It required an unflinching courage to face hearts resistant to guidance, to speak truths that were uncomfortable yet necessary, and to embody the very message one was called to deliver. God made this clear to Ezekiel. The people of Israel were not simply in need of comfort. They were in danger of losing sight of themselves, of the covenant that had bound them to their history and to their God. Their exile had stripped them of their temple, their land, and their routines of worship, leaving them vulnerable to despair and moral drift, and it was Ezekiel's task to illuminate the path back to awareness, responsibility, and hope. The divine imparted a promise to him, a reinforcement of inner strength, a fortification of will. I have made your face hard against their faces, and your forehead hard against their foreheads. God declared, instilling in Ezekiel the resilience required to confront a population that might initially reject, misunderstand, or ignore his warnings. From the first day of his mission, Ezekiel's life became a fusion of vision, action, and interpretation. He realized that words alone might falter in reaching hearts worn thin by exile, and so God instructed him to perform symbolic acts, tangible and unforgettable representations of the messages he was charged to convey. Lying on his side for hundreds of days, representing the years of sin and rebellion, Ezekiel became a living illustration of divine judgment and accountability. Shaving his hair and distributing it in ways that mirrored the fate of his people made abstract consequences tangible, immediate, and deeply resonant. These acts were not mere spectacle, but instruments of communication, designed to penetrate the collective consciousness of a people adrift, to awaken understanding through a combination of embodiment and metaphor, teaching lessons that words alone could not convey. Ezekiel's role as watchman was further complicated by the human nature of his audience. The exiles carried grief, anger, and mistrust, and some had begun to question whether God still watched over them. In this context, Ezekiel's prophetic voice had to navigate skepticism and resistance, balancing judgment with reassurance. He was to warn without alienating, to confront without condemning entirely, and to infuse hope into messages that often contained stark reminders of moral failure. Through his vigilance, the exiled community was offered both clarity and perspective, a mirror reflecting their own choices and the consequences that flowed from them, yet also a vision of restoration and reconciliation should they turn back toward faith and ethical living. The interconnectedness between Ezekiel's celestial vision and his earthly mission as watchman became increasingly clear. The wheels within wheels, moving in perfect harmony with the living beings, symbolized the meticulous balance of creation and divine oversight, echoing the precision with which Ezekiel was now to observe, interpret, and guide his people. Just as the celestial entities responded instantly to the divine will, Ezekiel's warnings and teachings were meant to align the human realm with a higher order, to awaken consciousness and moral responsibility in a people who might otherwise drift into despair and disobedience. Every vision, every symbolic action, every carefully spoken word was a thread in a larger tapestry, a divine plan woven through the turbulence of exile, and Ezekiel became the vital conduit through which understanding, warning, and hope flowed. Even as Ezekiel confronted resistance, he found that the role of watchman required not just strength but empathy. He needed to feel the pain, fear, and longing of the people, to inhabit their uncertainty and despair without becoming consumed by it, translating their experience into lessons and guidance rooted in divine truth. Through this delicate balance of authority and compassion, Ezekiel embodied the essence of spiritual stewardship, showing that leadership is not merely about proclamation but about bearing the weight of responsibility, reflecting divine concern, and sustaining hope in moments when it seemed all might be lost. In time, Ezekiel's mission as watchman extended beyond the immediate warnings and symbolic acts. It encompassed visions of restoration, promises of a renewed covenant, and teachings that emphasized personal responsibility before God. The exiles were reminded that their actions, their moral choices, and their spiritual attentiveness mattered profoundly, that even in displacement and hardship, each individual could respond to divine guidance and contribute to the renewal of their community. Ezekiel's vigilance, patience, and creative expression of divine truth transformed the exile from a period of mere suffering into an opportunity for reflection, moral awakening, and spiritual growth. Through it all, Ezekiel remained steadfast, guided by the memory of the vision by the Kibar River and by the knowledge that his calling was both necessary and sacred. He understood that a watchman does not serve for recognition or acclaim, but for the well-being of the people and the fulfillment of divine purpose. His life became a living testament to the profound interconnection between divine vision and human responsibility, demonstrating that even in the midst of exile and uncertainty, one person, empowered by faith and courage, can illuminate the path for many, bridging the gulf between despair and hope, between warning and restoration, and between human frailty and divine guidance. As Ezekiel fully embraced his role as the watchman for Israel, he quickly realized that mere words would often fall short of capturing the attention and hearts of the exiles around him. The people he spoke to were weary from displacement, their spirits weighed down by the loss of home, the destruction of the temple, and the uncertainty of their future. In this context, God instructed Ezekiel to take his prophetic mission beyond speech, to embody his messages in actions so striking that they could not be ignored or forgotten. These were not performances for spectacle or attention. They were living symbols, vivid enactments of divine truths meant to awaken a people who had become dulled by suffering and distance from their land. Ezekiel's life became a canvas on which the messages of God were painted in bold, unforgettable strokes. His body and presence transformed into instruments of revelation. One of the most remarkable and challenging of these divine instructions was the command to lie on his side for an extended period, a period stretching hundreds of days, each day representing a year of Israel's iniquity. As he lay upon the ground, Ezekiel carried with him the weight of collective transgression, his body becoming a tangible symbol of the sins that had estranged his people from God. Every movement, every turn, and every gesture held significance, signaling to the exiles the gravity of their moral and spiritual failings and the consequences that inevitably followed. This prolonged act of physical endurance was designed to impress upon the people that their actions, choices, and lapses in faith were not abstract concepts but realities with tangible, lasting effects. It was a silent yet powerful sermon, communicated not through spoken language but through the very presence of the prophet who bore the story of Israel's shortcomings in the most visceral way imaginable. The symbolism extended further when Ezekiel was instructed to shave his head and beard, dividing the hair into portions that would represent distinct destinies for the exiled population. One part was burned to signify destruction, another cut with a sword to reflect conquest or death, and the remaining strands scattered to symbolize dispersion across the land. Each strand carried a weight far beyond its physical size, a representation of fates that could otherwise only be spoken of in fearful whispers or prophetic declarations. Through this act, the people could witness the immediacy and seriousness of divine judgment, understanding that their choices were intertwined with consequences both immediate and far-reaching. By transforming such abstract concepts into concrete visual realities, Ezekiel made moral and spiritual truths accessible to a population that might otherwise struggle to perceive them amid the trauma of exile. What made these actions particularly profound was the personal cost to Ezekiel himself. He did not merely instruct others to consider sin and redemption. He lived it, absorbed its intensity, and demonstrated it in ways that exposed him to vulnerability, fatigue, and societal judgment. In performing these symbolic acts, he blurred the line between prophet and message, becoming inseparable from the divine warnings he conveyed. His body, his presence, and his endurance all served as a continuous, living testament to the seriousness of God's commands and the need for moral accountability. The people could see in Ezekiel the embodiment of divine concern, the tangible evidence that God's messages were neither distant nor abstract, but intimately concerned with their daily lives, choices, and spiritual well-being. These dramatic acts also functioned as an educational tool, shaping understanding through repetition, observation, and reflection. As the exiles witnessed the prophet's unwavering commitment, they were confronted with the reality of their situation in a way that words alone could not achieve. The image of a man lying on the ground for hundreds of days, or a head shaved in precise divisions to convey fate, created memories that would linger, reinforcing the lessons of moral vigilance, repentance, and hope for restoration. In this way, Ezekiel's prophetic actions became a form of immersive teaching, ensuring that the principles he sought to instill were encoded not just in minds, but in the collective consciousness of his people. Beyond the immediate visual impact, Ezekiel's symbolic acts carried profound spiritual resonance. They mirrored the inner journey required of the exiles themselves, to confront uncomfortable truths, to acknowledge shortcomings, to endure periods of reflection and humility, and ultimately to emerge with a renewed sense of purpose and alignment with divine will. In performing these acts, Ezekiel demonstrated that spiritual understanding is not merely an intellectual exercise but an experiential one, where insight and transformation are inseparable from the tangible realities of lived experience. The prophetic gestures became a bridge between the divine and human realms, translating visions of judgment, mercy, and restoration into forms that could be apprehended through sight, emotion, and reflection. Ezekiel's commitment to these acts also reinforced his authority as a prophet. The people recognized that his guidance was not theoretical or distant. It was embodied in a man who had undergone trials, lived through symbolic suffering, and carried divine messages with unwavering fidelity. Each act was a testament to his courage, faith, and dedication, illustrating that the messages he delivered were not simply words to be heard but realities to be reckoned with, experienced, and internalized. In this way, the symbolic actions did more than communicate warnings. They inspired respect, reflection, and ultimately, hope, revealing the path from judgment to redemption. Through these dramatic expressions of divine instruction, Ezekiel became more than a prophet who spoke. He became a living emblem of God's presence and concern, a conduit through which moral and spiritual truths were vividly unmistakably communicated. His life, actions, and endurance transformed ordinary moments into profound lessons, creating an indelible imprint on the collective memory of the exiles. It was through this blend of courage, symbolism, and fidelity that Ezekiel conveyed the depth of God's messages, ensuring that even in exile, the people of Israel could see, understand, and ultimately aspire to return to the principles and faith that defined their identity and destiny. As Ezekiel continued to fulfill his calling by the banks of the Kibar River and throughout the communities of the exiled Israelites, he came to understand that his mission was as much about instilling hope as it was about issuing warnings, and that the messages he conveyed needed to balance the stark reality of judgment with the profound promise of restoration. The people he addressed were caught in a liminal space, neither fully connected to the homeland they had lost nor entirely grounded in the foreign land where they now dwelled, their hearts burdened by grief, fear, and uncertainty, and their spiritual vision clouded by despair. Ezekiel's role, therefore, was not merely to speak of punishment or divine retribution, but to reveal the full spectrum of God's intentions, demonstrating that even amid the consequences of disobedience and the sobering reality of exile, there existed a path toward renewal, a vision of hope capable of rekindling faith and guiding the people toward moral and spiritual awakening. Through the vivid visions he experienced, and the symbolic actions he enacted, Ezekiel painted a complex picture of divine justice intertwined with mercy. His prophecies often began with an acknowledgement of failure, a clear and unflinching articulation of the sins, rebellion, and moral shortcomings of Israel. He spoke of the arrogance that had led them to neglect the covenant, the idolatry that had diverted their devotion, and the social injustices that had fractured their community. Yet, even in these pronouncements of judgment, Ezekiel embedded the seeds of restoration, emphasizing that God's intent was never abandonment but correction and guidance, that the consequences faced by the people were part of a divine strategy to bring them back into alignment with the principles and promises that had shaped their identity as a chosen nation. In this way, each message of judgment carried within it the possibility of renewal, a lifeline extended to those willing to listen, reflect, and respond with sincerity. The prophet's symbolic actions reinforced this dual message of accountability and hope. When he lay on his side for hundreds of days, he embodied the weight of sin and the inevitability of divine judgment. But the act itself, combined with his later prophecies, suggested that acknowledgement of wrongdoing was not the end. It was the necessary first step toward transformation. When he shaved his hair and distributed according to the fates of the people, the gesture represented both the certainty of consequences and the possibility of survival and eventual return for those who remained faithful. These acts transformed abstract theological concepts into tangible experiences, enabling the exiles to perceive that divine judgment was measured, purposeful, and ultimately geared toward restoration rather than despair. Ezekiel's messages were also imbued with a deep understanding of the human condition. He recognized that punishment without hope could only lead to further despair and disengagement, that a people who felt abandoned were unlikely to respond constructively to admonishment. Therefore, he carefully wove into his prophecies images of renewal, visions of a restored land, a renewed temple, and a revitalized spiritual community. He spoke of God's promise to replace hearts of stone with hearts of flesh, a metaphor for the inner transformation required for true repentance and moral awakening, demonstrating that the exile, while a period of suffering and reflection, was also an opportunity for growth, learning, and alignment with divine will. In emphasizing this promise of renewal, Ezekiel offered the exiles a tangible sense of hope, a vision of a future in which their identity, faith, and connection with God could be fully restored. Even in his prophecies directed toward foreign nations, Ezekiel balanced pronouncements of judgment with glimpses of order and divine purpose, illustrating that God's justice was universal and that the overarching plan encompassed both accountability and restoration. These messages reinforced for the Israelites that their suffering was neither arbitrary nor final, and that obedience, moral reflection, and faith could bring about reconciliation, not just with God, but within their community and with the wider world. His teachings emphasized that divine justice was precise and measured, intended to awaken the conscience rather than merely punish, and that restoration was always within reach for those willing to embrace transformation. Ezekiel's visionary experiences further underscored this duality of judgment and hope. The wheels within wheels, moving in perfect harmony with the celestial beings, symbolized a cosmos in which order and purpose prevailed, suggesting that even amid the chaos of exile, divine governance remained intact, guiding history toward a predetermined and restorative outcome. The sapphire throne, radiant and unapproachable in its majesty, represented both authority and care, reminding the people that God's presence was not diminished by distance or adversity but continued to oversee, protect, and offer guidance, promising eventual renewal and continuity. Through these symbols, Ezekiel communicated that divine judgment was part of a larger, benevolent plan, that suffering could be temporary, and that restoration awaited those who responded to God's call with humility and faithfulness. The prophet's words and actions cultivated a moral and spiritual framework for the exiles, teaching them that even in times of profound loss, destruction, and displacement, the path to redemption was available through personal responsibility, repentance, and steadfast adherence to the covenant. Ezekiel's combination of stark warnings and vivid promises created a sense of dynamic engagement with the divine, fostering an awareness that choices mattered, that moral integrity could be restored, and that God's care was both immediate and enduring. By intertwining messages of accountability with those of hope and renewal, Ezekiel ensured that the exiled Israelites could see themselves not solely as victims of circumstance, but as participants in a larger narrative, one in which divine guidance, moral awakening, and eventual restoration converge to offer a future filled with purpose and promise. In this intricate weaving of judgment and restoration, Ezekiel established a legacy that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of exile. His prophecies instilled a resilient vision of hope, emphasizing that God's plans were never final in destruction alone, and that restoration, renewal, and spiritual revival were always attainable through recognition of wrongdoing, deliberate moral action, and a return to covenantal faith. The people he addressed could witness in his actions and hear in his words that even amid the starkest warnings of judgment, the promise of renewal shone as an enduring beacon, guiding them through exile toward the restoration of identity, faith, and communal cohesion, demonstrating that divine purpose is both just and merciful, and that hope remains alive even in the darkest moments of human experience. As Ezekiel stood by the waters of the Kibar River, immersed in the profound stillness of exile and the lingering grief of his displaced people, he experienced a vision so overwhelming and majestic that it defied the ordinary boundaries of human perception. A vision that would come to define his prophetic mission and leave an indelible mark on the spiritual imagination of generations to come. In this extraordinary encounter, the heavens appeared to open before him not in a literal tearing of the sky, but as if the veil between the earthly realm and the divine had lifted, revealing a reality imbued with awe-inspiring glory and unimaginable complexity, a reality that demanded his complete attention, humility, and reverence. It was in this moment that Ezekiel perceived the throne of God, a structure of resplendent sapphire that gleamed with a deep, celestial blue, radiating an otherworldly light that suggested both purity and unapproachable majesty, the very embodiment of divine authority and transcendent beauty. The throne was not simply an object of splendor. It was a manifestation of divine presence and sovereignty, a symbol that even in the midst of exile, far from Jerusalem and the temple that once stood as a tangible sign of God's dwelling, the Almighty remained both near and omnipotent, governing the cosmos with absolute order and wisdom. Surrounding this sapphire throne were 4 living beings, each more extraordinary than Ezekiel's mind could fully comprehend, their forms at once reminiscent of humanity yet unmistakably otherworldly, merging features from the natural and the divine into a harmonious yet startling ensemble. Each being bore 4 faces: the face of a man, symbolizing intelligence and reflection; the face of a lion, representing strength, courage, and the fierce protection of God's will; the face of an ox, a testament to steadfastness, service, and unyielding perseverance; and the face of an eagle, evoking swiftness, vision, and spiritual insight. These multifaceted forms were not mere artistic embellishments but profound symbols, suggesting the fullness of divine attributes and the intricate balance of wisdom, power, service, and insight that characterized the divine governance of the universe. As Ezekiel observed them, their movements were precise and synchronized, wings extending in a delicate balance of worship and function, some touching one another in reverent harmony while others covered their bodies in modesty, a constant reminder of the sanctity and disciplined obedience that permeated the celestial realm. Beneath and around these living beings, Ezekiel discerned wheels within wheels, interlocking and moving in perfect harmony, a mechanism of astonishing complexity that seemed to defy conventional understanding of motion and direction. The wheels, gleaming with the hue of precious stones, shimmered with a bluish-green radiance, reflecting the light of the sapphire throne and the fiery brilliance that emanated from the figure above. These wheels moved seamlessly in any direction without turning, rising and descending in precise coordination with the movements of the living beings, suggesting a divine omnipresence and an interconnection of all creation under God's command. The intricate relationship between the beings and the wheels conveyed an image of a universe orchestrated with meticulous care, where every action and movement responded instantly to divine will, illustrating a cosmic harmony that extended beyond human comprehension yet could be glimpsed through the prophet's visionary experience. Above the living beings and their wheels, Ezekiel saw a firmament resembling gleaming crystal, a translucent expanse that separated the throne from the celestial creatures yet reflected and amplified their brilliance, adding layers of depth and mystery to the vision. It was through this crystalline firmament that the radiance of the divine figure shone with unparalleled intensity. A figure with a human-like appearance yet enveloped in glory, brilliance like molten amber and fire radiating from waist to feet, conveying a sense of both majesty and purity, of power intertwined with mercy, of judgment tempered by divine grace. The prophet compared the splendor surrounding this figure to a rainbow on a rainy day, invoking the covenantal promise of God, a reminder that even in the midst of overwhelming awe and judgment, there existed a steadfast assurance of divine faithfulness, hope, and mercy toward creation. Ezekiel's encounter with this vision was not a passive observation but a profound, transformative experience that demanded both physical and spiritual submission, compelling him to fall face down in reverence, fully aware of the immense disparity between human frailty and divine perfection. The complexity and majesty of what he witnessed served not only as an affirmation of God's omnipotence, but also as a source of courage and purpose for the prophet, reinforcing the message that the exiled Israelites, though distant from their homeland and temple, were still encompassed by divine attention, cared for, and ultimately destined for restoration. The living beings, wheels, throne, and radiant figure together constituted a dynamic tableau of power, order, and beauty, each element reinforcing the others in an intricate display of interdependence, reflecting a universe in which God's presence was pervasive, responsive, and harmoniously organized. This vision became the foundation for Ezekiel's prophetic mission, a lens through which he interpreted his responsibilities as a watchman, a guide, and a messenger of God's will. It was through the understanding of this celestial scene that Ezekiel derived both authority and insight, enabling him to convey messages of judgment and hope with authenticity and urgency. The imagery of the throne, the living beings, and the wheels served as a constant reminder to him and to the people he addressed that divine oversight was absolute, that every act, whether of obedience or transgression, was witnessed and responded to within the intricate design of God's plan, and that even in exile, the promise of divine presence and ultimate restoration was unwavering and ever available to those who sought it with sincerity and faith. Ezekiel's description of this vision, communicated through his vivid storytelling and symbolic actions, continues to resonate across centuries, inspiring generations to contemplate the grandeur, complexity, and mercy of the divine, the sapphire throne, the radiant figure, the living beings with multifaceted faces, and the interlocking wheels became more than symbolic constructs. They emerged as enduring images of divine majesty, omnipresence, and the intricate beauty of a universe held in perfect harmony under the watchful care of God, offering hope, guidance, and a profound sense of connection to the divine presence even in the most challenging circumstances. As Ezekiel continued to immerse himself in the weighty responsibility of his prophetic calling, he realized that his messages extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the exiled Israelites. They encompassed a broader, more universal scope that demonstrated the sovereignty of God over all nations and peoples. A reminder that divine authority was not confined to Jerusalem or the land of Israel, but extended across the vast expanse of the known world, influencing the rise and fall of empires, the fates of kings, and the destiny of entire peoples. The prophet's visions and proclamations revealed that the same God who had called him to serve as watchman for his own people also governed the affairs of surrounding nations, holding them accountable for arrogance, cruelty, idolatry, and oppression, while simultaneously asserting the ultimate supremacy of divine will over human ambition, territorial expansion, and political machinations. Through this lens, Ezekiel's prophecies acquired a profound sense of scope and depth, showing that God's moral and ethical expectations were universal, and that the lessons of obedience, justice, and humility extended beyond Israel to all who inhabited the earth. In delivering these messages, Ezekiel spoke with a clarity and authority that came from having witnessed the radiant throne, the four living beings, and the interlocking wheels within wheels, a vision that impressed upon him the order, precision, and omnipresence of God. It was from this vantage point of divine insight that he could confidently assert judgments against powerful neighboring nations such as Tyre, Sidon, Egypt, and Babylon, each of which had grown proud through wealth, military might, or perceived invincibility. Ezekiel warned that no amount of human pride or earthly power could evade the scrutiny of a God whose presence permeated every corner of creation, whose eyes penetrated every fortress, and whose decrees determined the ultimate fates of rulers and citizens alike. He depicted these nations in vivid imagery, portraying their cities, leaders, and armies as ultimately fragile before the inexorable force of divine justice, a force that would humble the proud, bring accountability to the arrogant, and restore balance to a world often distorted by greed, oppression, and moral failure. Ezekiel's proclamations were not merely theoretical or distant threats. They were rooted in the realities of human behavior and political structures, presented in a way that made their inevitability both understandable and compelling. Through intricate allegories and symbolic actions, he illustrated the consequences of defiance against God's authority. For instance, in his messages against Tyre, Ezekiel described the city as a majestic fortress, rich and exalted above the nations, yet destined to fall like a giant brought low, its wealth and influence scattered to the wind, demonstrating that human pride, however formidable, could not withstand divine judgment. Against Egypt, he emphasized the futility of relying on human alliances or military strength, highlighting that even the mightiest nations were subject to the same divine laws that governed Israel, and that their perceived power was ultimately subordinate to the will of the Almighty. These prophecies served a dual purpose. They reminded Israel that God's justice was comprehensive and impartial, and they cautioned the surrounding nations that arrogance and cruelty could not escape accountability, underscoring the universality of moral responsibility. While Ezekiel's words carried the weight of warning, they were not delivered solely as threats. They were also imbued with a sense of order, purpose, and restoration that reflected God's ultimate plan for humanity. By portraying the judgments of surrounding nations, Ezekiel illustrated the principle that divine intervention, while sometimes severe, served a larger purpose: to maintain balance, uphold justice, and prepare the way for renewal, both for Israel and for the wider world. Each pronouncement of doom was framed within a context that emphasized the inevitability of accountability, the consequences of unchecked pride, and the potential for transformation and reconciliation should nations and individuals turn toward righteousness and humility. Ezekiel's ability to integrate these dual themes of justice and hope, punishment and restoration, allowed his prophecies to resonate with enduring relevance, presenting a universe governed by a morally coherent and omnipotent God whose concern for order and justice extended beyond the borders of any single people. Ezekiel's engagement with the wider world also highlighted the interconnectedness of human affairs and divine oversight, demonstrating that the exile of Israel was not an isolated event but part of a broader tapestry of divine orchestration. The trials faced by neighboring nations, the rise and fall of empires, and the shifts in political power all served to reinforce the lesson that God's sovereignty encompassed every corner of human activity, from the smallest village to the grandest city-state. By articulating these messages, Ezekiel provided the Israelites with a sense of perspective. Their suffering, while profound and immediate, was situated within a larger framework of divine order, a world in which justice, accountability, and hope were not abstract concepts but operational principles guiding the destinies of nations. This perspective offered reassurance that God's attention was not limited to a single people or a single land, and that the ultimate trajectory of history was directed by a presence far greater than any human ruler. Moreover, Ezekiel's prophecies against neighboring nations reinforced the principle that ethical behavior, adherence to divine law, and humility before God were essential for all peoples. By showing that God held Egypt, Tyre, Sidon, and other nations accountable, Ezekiel emphasized that divine authority was universal, and that no one could claim immunity from the moral imperatives that governed human life. This universality of divine judgment underscored a central theme of Ezekiel's mission: the interconnectedness of obedience, justice, and restoration across all nations, highlighting that the same God who offered Israel hope and renewal demanded integrity and responsibility from every corner of creation. Through this framework, the exiles could understand that their faithfulness had implications beyond themselves, contributing to a cosmic narrative in which righteousness and ethical conduct were recognized, rewarded, and essential for the restoration of harmony in the world. In recounting these judgments, Ezekiel masterfully blended symbolic imagery, detailed visions, and moral exhortation to create a compelling narrative that engaged both the imagination and the conscience. He transformed political realities into vivid moral lessons, demonstrating that human ambition and pride were always subordinate to divine authority. and that the sovereignty of God extended not only over Israel but over the entirety of creation. His messages were both cautionary and instructive, warning nations of the consequences of arrogance while offering glimpses of restoration for those willing to embrace humility and righteousness. In doing, Ezekiel reinforced the cohesion of his broader prophetic mission, linking the experiences of Israel with the fates of surrounding nations, and underscoring the comprehensive reach of God's power, justice, and mercy across all lands, a timeless lesson in divine sovereignty. Ethical responsibility, and the enduring hope of redemption. In the midst of the Babylonian exile, as the people of Judah grappled with displacement, uncertainty, and the painful severance from their sacred homeland, Ezekiel was granted yet another extraordinary vision, one that offered a glimpse not only of divine majesty, but also of a meticulously ordered future in which holiness, structure, and covenantal fidelity would be restored to Israel, a vision so detailed and precise that it seemed almost architectural in its complexity, yet deeply symbolic in meaning, conveying lessons that extended far beyond mere physical measurements or urban planning. In this revelation, Ezekiel was transported in spirit to a high mountain within the land of Israel, a vantage point that allowed him to see a city unlike any he had known, a city carefully designed and organized to reflect the principles of divine order, where every space, courtyard, and structure bore a significance that harmonized human habitation with sacred purpose, and every aspect of the layout symbolized the relationship between God and his people, the sanctity of worship, and the moral and spiritual responsibilities entrusted to those who dwelled there. Accompanied by an angelic guide who carried a measuring rod and a linen cord, Ezekiel walked through this visionary city with meticulous care, observing every detail, from the outer boundaries to the innermost sanctuaries, learning how each area was designated for specific functions that intertwined civic life, ritual observance, and the presence of the divine. The city itself, with its concentric courtyards, elevated sanctuaries, and carefully delimited spaces, represented a hierarchy of holiness, drawing the faithful progressively closer to the divine presence, a physical manifestation of the spiritual journey toward righteousness and communion with God. The central temple, larger and more elaborate than any prior structure Ezekiel had known, served as the focal point of the city, its grandeur and precision reflecting the perfection of divine law and the sanctity of worship, where every measurement, every threshold, and every altar was imbued with meaning, demonstrating that holiness was not merely an abstract concept but a tangible reality that could be experienced through reverent action and disciplined observance. Beyond the city itself, the vision extended to the reorganization of the land of Israel, with territories apportioned among the tribes, a deliberate and orderly allocation that symbolized the renewal of covenantal promises and the restoration of communal harmony, ensuring that the people's relationship with the land and with one another reflected divine intention. Within this division, special areas were reserved for the priests and the temple, underscoring the centrality of worship and the sacred role of those who served as intermediaries between God and the community, emphasizing that spiritual integrity and moral responsibility were foundational to the nation's well-being. Ezekiel's vision conveyed that the re-establishment of the temple and the careful organization of the land were not merely political or logistical acts, but expressions of divine order, illustrating the inseparable connection between the sacred, the social, and the ethical dimensions of human life, and reminding the exiles that restoration would involve both physical and spiritual renewal. The intricate details of Ezekiel's visionary temple, its gates, chambers, altars, and courtyards were conveyed with such precision that they suggested a tangible reality. Yet each measurement and structural element also carried symbolic weight, teaching lessons about purity, devotion, and the proximity of God to those who approached with humility and obedience. Every courtyard represented layers of access to divine presence, every threshold a moral or spiritual threshold that tested the hearts and intentions of the worshippers. And the central sanctuary embodied the culmination of spiritual aspiration, a place where God's glory could dwell in full, unmediated, and radiant expression. The visionary experience conveyed that holiness was structured, disciplined, and purposeful, not random or accidental, and that living in alignment with divine order required intentionality, reverence, and an understanding of one's role within a larger cosmic and social framework. Ezekiel's description of the temple and the land also reflected a profound theological message, that God had neither abandoned the exiled people nor allowed their displacement to signify divine disfavor. Rather, the vision served as a beacon of hope and a promise of ultimate restoration, a reassurance that their faithfulness, repentance, and adherence to divine law would be recognized and rewarded, that the covenant between God and Israel remained intact, and that even amid destruction and exile, the future held the possibility of renewal, unity, and divine blessing. The city, the temple, and the restructured land collectively illustrated a world in which human societies could be realigned with divine principles, demonstrating that order, holiness, and covenant fidelity were not abstract ideals but achievable realities, awaiting the faithful who would embrace them with devotion and integrity. Furthermore, the vision carried layers of prophetic significance, linking Israel as present suffering to a future hope, reinforcing the idea that God's purposes were not thwarted by human weakness, rebellion, or political upheaval. By witnessing this detailed arrangement of land and temple, Ezekiel internalized the assurance that divine order would ultimately prevail, that the scattered tribes would one day be reunited, that worship and justice would be restored to their proper places, and that the relationship between God and His people could be renewed in a manner that transcended past failures and shortcomings. This foresight into the future provided the exiled Israelites with a moral and spiritual compass, showing them that even in exile, their identity, faith, and destiny were guided by divine wisdom, and that their adherence to ethical and spiritual principles remained central to the fulfillment of God's promises. Ezekiel's visionary experience emphasized the integration of sacred space, social organization, and moral order, highlighting that the restoration of Israel would not be superficial or purely political but deeply holistic, encompassing the spiritual, ethical, and communal dimensions of life. The architectural and territorial precision of the city and temples served as metaphors for the alignment of human conduct with divine will, demonstrating that obedience, purity, and reverence were essential for the flourishing of the community and the enduring presence of God among them. By portraying this meticulously ordered future, Ezekiel provided not only a vision of hope but also a blueprint for spiritual renewal, a symbolic yet tangible model of how the faithful could live in harmony with divine principles, reclaim their sacred identity, and restore covenantal fidelity across generations. Through this remarkable vision, Ezekiel conveyed the enduring message that the presence of God, the sanctity of worship, and the moral and spiritual organization of the people were inseparable, and that restoration, both physical and spiritual, required alignment with divine order, discipline, and reverence. The sapphire throne he had seen by the Kibar River, the radiant figures, and the interlocking wheels now found their earthly reflection in the detailed temple and reorganized land, showing that God's glory and authority were not confined to distant visions but could shape and inspire the lives of His people, guiding them toward holiness, justice, and covenantal renewal in a world scarred by exile and uncertainty. A timeless testament to divine faithfulness and the transformative power of vision, hope, and obedience. Amid the sweeping visions, dramatic actions, and intricate prophecies that defined Ezekiel's ministry, one of the most transformative aspects of his teachings was the emphasis on personal responsibility, a concept that would come to significantly shape the trajectory of Jewish ethical thought and the moral consciousness of generations to follow, as he insisted that each individual, rather than being condemned or absolved based on the deeds of their ancestors, would be held accountable for their own actions and choices, a principle that challenged prevailing notions of collective or inherited guilt and placed the weight of moral agency squarely upon each person's shoulders, demanding self-reflection, integrity, and conscientious decision-making in every facet of life. This radical shift in perspective emerged within the context of exile and societal upheaval, where the people of Judah, uprooted from their homeland and grappling with the trauma of displacement, were confronted with the consequences of national sin. Yet Ezekiel's message clarified that divine justice was precise, discerning, and intimately attuned to the individual heart, emphasizing that while the community as a whole might suffer the repercussions of collective wrongdoing, each person's moral responsibility remained distinct, personal, and unavoidable, a reality that imbued every choice with profound significance. Ezekiel's insistence on personal accountability was not abstract or theoretical. It was communicated through both his words and symbolic actions, reinforcing the principle in ways that were tangible and unforgettable for his audience. Through acts such as lying on his side for extended periods or shaving and dividing his hair, he dramatized the consequences of sin and the patterns of judgment that might befall Israel and Judah. Yet within these acts he embedded the notion that while nations could be disciplined collectively, the fate of each soul rested in its own moral orientation, reflecting God's intimate knowledge of individual intentions and deeds. By doing, Ezekiel illuminated a profound theological truth, that human beings were not passive recipients of divine favor or retribution, but active participants in the shaping of their destinies. With choices, repentance, and ethical behavior directly influencing the trajectory of their lives and the well-being of the broader community. A perspective that offered both warning and empowerment, as it underscored the transformative potential inherent in personal integrity and conscientious action. This focus on individual accountability also served as a counterbalance to despair during the exile, providing hope that despite the calamities surrounding them, each person retained the capacity to align with divine will and pursue righteousness, an empowering message that encouraged reflection, self-correction, and a recommitment to ethical and spiritual principles even in the face of overwhelming national tragedy. Ezekiel's teachings emphasized that the divine gaze was not merely cast over grand historical or political developments, but also penetrated the personal sphere, assessing the heart, intentions, and choices of each individual, highlighting a God who was both just and intimately concerned with the moral condition of each soul, capable of rewarding faithfulness and rectifying wrongdoing in accordance with personal merit. This emphasis on personal responsibility infused every aspect of Ezekiel's prophetic ministry, from his oracles against Israel and neighboring nations to the detailed visions of the temple and the reorganized land, demonstrating that alignment with divine order began within the hearts of individuals before it could manifest in communal restoration or national renewal. Through his vivid portrayal of divine oversight, including the radiant throne, the interlocking wheels, and the four living beings with their multiple faces, Ezekiel conveyed a universe in which every action, thought, and intention was observed and valued, reinforcing the ethical principle that individuals could not hide behind collective identity or ancestral legacy, but were accountable for the choices they made in accordance with God's law. In practical terms, this meant that each person's moral and spiritual decisions carried real consequences, shaping not only their own lives but also influencing the ethical and spiritual fabric of the community. a lesson designed to instill both humility and responsibility, reminding the exiles that their faithfulness or lack thereof was a determining factor in the restoration of their people, the renewal of covenantal promises, and the ongoing relationship between God and Israel. Ezekiel's teachings on individual accountability were further amplified through the allegorical and prophetic imagery that permeated his ministry, allowing the exiles to internalize complex theological concepts in concrete and memorable forms. The stark depictions of judgment against Jerusalem, Tyre, Egypt, and other nations illustrated the consequences of pride, injustice, and rebellion. Yet by framing these narratives alongside explicit assertions of personal responsibility, Ezekiel underscored that ethical choice was the domain of the individual. A king, a soldier, a priest, or a common citizen could each act in ways that aligned with or opposed divine will, and each would bear the results of their decisions. This approach cultivated a moral framework in which accountability was universal, equitable, and inescapable, shifting the focus from inherited guilt or unearned reward to the deliberate cultivation of virtue, integrity, and obedience, thereby deepening the ethical sophistication of the Israelite understanding of justice and divine oversight. Moreover, this principle of personal responsibility resonated beyond Ezekiel's immediate context, influencing later Jewish thought and spiritual practice, including the writings of subsequent prophets and the interpretive traditions that shaped rabbinic discourse, where the idea that each soul is individually accountable became a cornerstone of moral theology. Ethical reasoning and spiritual instruction. By emphasizing that each person's actions mattered, Ezekiel inspired a culture of introspection, self-improvement, and conscious moral engagement, teaching that the pursuit of righteousness was not merely a communal or ceremonial obligation, but a personal, deliberate, and ongoing endeavor, requiring awareness, commitment, and courage to choose rightly even amidst challenging circumstances. Ezekiel's focus on individual accountability also provided a crucial complement to his broader messages of hope, restoration, and divine fidelity, demonstrating that personal ethical conduct was both a prerequisite for and a participant in the realization of the promised renewal of Israel. By linking personal responsibility with the overarching narrative of exile, judgment, and eventual restoration, Ezekiel created a seamless integration between the spiritual, ethical, and communal dimensions of life, showing that the transformation of the nation began in the hearts of each individual, and that collective redemption was inseparable from the cultivation of personal virtue, moral clarity, and adherence to God's commands. In essence, Ezekiel's insistence that every person is accountable for their own actions provided a transformative ethical framework that elevated personal agency, shaped moral consciousness, and laid the foundation for enduring principles of justice, responsibility, and spiritual integrity. His teachings encouraged individuals to recognize the weight of their choices, to embrace ethical and spiritual discipline, and to understand that their actions, both great and small, were significant within the broader tapestry of divine order, offering a timeless lesson in the power of personal accountability to shape lives, communities, and the enduring relationship between humanity and the divine. As we reach the conclusion of Ezekiel's extraordinary journey, it becomes clear that his life, visions, and teachings have left a legacy that transcends centuries, continuing to shape the spiritual, cultural, and ethical landscapes of both Jewish and Christian traditions. From the vivid imagery of God's throne and the interlocking wheels to the symbolic actions that captured the attention of an exiled people, Ezekiel's experiences were not merely historical or ceremonial. They were transformative, offering profound insights into the nature of divine presence. Human responsibility, and the possibility of renewal even in the most challenging circumstances. His visions of celestial beings, radiant light, and intricately structured temples communicated truths that are both awe-inspiring and deeply instructive, reminding us that the divine is both majestic and intimately engaged with the lives of individuals and communities. Through these revelations, Ezekiel provided a blueprint for understanding the relationship between God and humanity, emphasizing that holiness, obedience, and moral integrity are foundational to spiritual life, while also offering hope that restoration and renewal are always within the reach of those who remain faithful. Ezekiel's symbolic acts, from lying on his side for years to shaving and distributing his hair in prophetic demonstrations, exemplified the creative ways in which divine messages could be communicated beyond words, capturing the imagination and attention of his audience in ways that ordinary speech could not achieve. These acts conveyed the gravity of sin, the certainty of judgment, and the promise of redemption, leaving a lasting impression on those who witnessed them, and on generations of readers and interpreters who would later reflect on their meaning. The intensity and commitment of Ezekiel's prophetic ministry illustrate the profound personal engagement required to deliver God's messages effectively, and they remind us that the work of faith often demands courage, patience, and the willingness to embody one's convictions fully. The influence of Ezekiel extends beyond theology into the realms of art, literature, and worship practices, inspiring countless depictions of celestial visions, dramatic representations of divine encounters, and reflections on the themes of resurrection, hope, and spiritual renewal. From visual art that captures the majesty of the four living beings and the sapphire throne to literary works that evoke the ethical and spiritual lessons embedded in his prophecies, Ezekiel's impact resonates across cultures and centuries, shaping both religious imagination and moral reflection. His teachings on personal responsibility, accountability, and the pursuit of righteousness have informed ethical thought, providing a moral framework that emphasizes individual agency while situating it within a broader divine and communal context. The concept that each person's actions carry significance, that choices have consequences, and that ethical conduct is intertwined with spiritual vitality remains a cornerstone of both Jewish and Christian moral philosophy, illustrating the enduring relevance of Ezekiel's insights. Ezekiel's vision of the future temple and the reorganized land of Israel, in particular, continues to serve as a symbol of hope and divine order, demonstrating that even amid evil, loss, or upheaval, there is a pathway toward restoration, unity, and spiritual renewal. The detailed depiction of sacred spaces, the careful division of land, and the emphasis on holiness and reverence provide both a metaphorical and practical model for aligning human life with divine principles. These visions remind us that restoration is not merely a return to a former state, but a transformation that integrates justice, ethics, worship, and communal harmony, illustrating the profound interconnectedness of spiritual, moral, and social renewal. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Ezekiel, we are reminded that his message is not confined to a distant historical context, but continues to speak to us today, offering guidance, inspiration, and hope in a world often marked by uncertainty, injustice, and moral complexity. His insistence on personal accountability encourages us to consider the impact of our actions, the importance of ethical decision-making, and the potential each individual has to contribute to the well-being of their community and the fulfillment of higher principles. His visions inspire awe and wonder, inviting us to contemplate the majesty of the divine and the infinite possibilities of spiritual insight. And his promise of restoration reassures us that, even in times of exile or hardship, renewal and hope remain possible when we align our lives with values of justice, faithfulness, and devotion. In sharing the story of Ezekiel with you today, I hope you have felt the power, depth, and enduring relevance of his visions, actions, and teachings. His life reminds us that spiritual insight requires attention, courage, and the willingness to engage fully with the divine message, and that the pursuit of righteousness and renewal is both a personal and collective journey. If you have enjoyed this exploration of Ezekiel's story, please do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content, and share it with others who may also find guidance and encouragement in his extraordinary journey. Your support allows us to continue sharing meaningful stories from history, faith, and culture that inspire reflection, learning, and spiritual growth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and visions of Ezekiel. May his story inspire you to embrace personal responsibility, seek spiritual insight, and hold on to hope even in challenging times. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with inspiration.